And the goal of the session is to focus on the media, to focus on media coverage, to focus on them as journalists, not so much to rehash the incident, to rehash what happened. However, we also want to make sure that we talk about it in the context of South Carolina history, particularly South Carolina's racial history. And so I have suggested to them that when possible to try to address it in that context. And I've heard this already several times at the conference this weekend. When we hear about the civil rights movement, when we hear the history of the civil rights movement, we don't hear about South Carolina very often. We hear about Alabama and Mississippi and some other history, but we rarely hear the history in South Carolina. I wonder why. And one of the questions raised is, do the media have a role in that? And I'll be curious to know if the media's role in the reporting of this story, the Charleston church shooting, and I'm not sure we are in agreement on what even to call it, but is the reporting a part of how we are going to see this historically as we move forward? Because if so, that's very significant. I'm going to step out of the way now and let the panelists have the floor. I'll introduce them. The first on your left is Herb Frazier. Herb is a former reporter with the Post and Courier. Former meaning he was a reporter there for how many years?
About 18 years.
About 18 years. Alumnus of school, and he is a Charlestonian, a native Charlestonian. And so we thought it would be good that he could bring us some context. He has also written a book, he's co-author of a book called We Are Charleston, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Our next panelist is Raphael James, anchor for WCSC TV in Charleston. Next is Billie Jean Shaw, a reporter, at least for now, for WIS TV in Columbia. And Eric Frazier, I didn't get them in order, did I? Sorry. Former reporter for the Post and Courier in Charleston, former columnist for the Charlotte Observer. Okay? And so I've asked Herb if he would make a few comments to kick off the panel, and we'll give each panelist a few minutes, about 5 minutes maybe, to sort of tell us what they'd like to. And then we have a wonderful audience. We'll open it up for question and answer. Herb?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Ken, for this opportunity to talk about this event that has obviously stirred Charleston and is still being felt and discussed in Charleston. But first, I want to let you know that there are two kinds of people in Charleston. There's people who live somewhere else and come there, and they call those folks come ya. But there are people like me who grew up in Charleston, know every little alleyway in Charleston and all the stories. We call those people Binya. So I've been there for a long time. I spent the first 14 years of my life in Charleston. And I lived in the neighborhood immediately surrounding Mother Emanuel, called Ansonboro. Now that neighborhood does not look like it did in the 50s and 60s when I was a kid there because of gentrification. I was a member of Emanuel. I have very many fond memories of Emanuel. I have friends and family who are still members of Emanuel. And whenever, after I left Charleston in 1965 and moved away, came back to Charleston, Emanuel was one of those places that I wanted to visit and reconnect with. So, on that night of this tragedy, the phone rang at 10 o'clock. My youngest daughter called me, and she said, "Daddy, there's been a shooting at your church." I said, "What do you mean a shooting at the church? You don't have shootings in churches, you know?" And so we found out after my wife, who's sitting here with me, Adrienne, We drove down, we were living on James Island, so if anyone knows Charleston, we were living on James Island. We drove across the connector. We got close to the church, and off in the distance, we could see all the lights, red lights, blue lights, and we knew something really, really big had happened. And we were listening to the radio, and we heard on the radio, and we could see a helicopter circling around, police helicopter with a bright light shining down on the ground. So we knew something terrible had happened, and we turned on the radio, and we heard on the radio that there had been a shooting at the church. They were looking for a suspect, and the suspect was still, could be somewhere in the neighborhood. Adrian and I decided that maybe we don't need to get too close. We need to go back home because we didn't know what was going to happen. So we went back home. We turned on the television, the WCSC TV, Channel 5, and this man was on TV. Raphael James was on TV, live from not too far from the church, reporting on what was going on at that moment. So we woke up, we stayed up for much of the night until about 2 o'clock in the morning. And then we woke up and turned and grabbed the paper, and this was the headline in the Post and Courier the next morning. And that began a series of not only community events to bring people together, but also a series of deep, deep emotional experiences within people across Charleston who started to come together as a community to try to understand what was happening, to try to embrace those who had been affected by this tragedy, and see what the community needed to do moving forward. Now, the Post and Courier reached out to Marjorie Wentworth. This happened on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, they called Marjorie Wentworth, who's the poet laureate of South Carolina. And they asked Marjorie to write a poem for the Sunday paper. Because in the paper, they not only wanted to have, of course, the follow-up news stories, but they wanted to have profiles of those who lost their lives in this tragedy, and also report on the 5 who survived. So they asked Marjorie to write a poem. And she entitled the poem Holy City, because Charleston is a holy city. And I won't read the poem, but this is her poem in which she talked about what this tragedy meant, how it affected people. She mentioned those who lost their lives and how we should hold them close and near to us as we look into the Charleston skies for answers to why this happened. Well, the poem ran in the paper that Sunday along with little vignettes on each of those who were affected and other stories in the package that Sunday. And the BBC picked up Marjorie's poem, and it was broadcast on the BBC. And Marjorie's agent saw the BBC report and called Marjorie and asked Marjorie, hey, you need to do more on this. And that led to this book, We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph of Mother Emanuel. Marjorie called me and said her agent is encouraging her to do something, and she knew that I had an affiliation with the church and that I'm a Binya and I understand Charleston. And so I said, yes, I'd love to help you do that, because we all really were looking around trying to figure out what could we do in our own capacities to help this city heal and also bring light to this tragedy and try to understand why it happened. And I knew that I could help in that endeavor, but I knew that even though I understood Charleston and I understood the church, I did not fully understand the church's history. And we needed the expertise of a historian. So I reached out to Dr. Bernard Powers, who was a history professor at the College of Charleston, because I knew Dr. Powers had been doing ongoing research into the history of the AME denomination in the United States, but more focused on South Carolina. Because as you know, Mother Emanuel is an AME church, and we knew that a lot of people around the country wouldn't know what the letters AME stood for. African Methodist Episcopal Church, and its history, its founding around 1817 in Philadelphia, and how the church moved into South Carolina during the colonial period, and what the role of the church was then in a free-holding society because a slaveholding society, I should say, because the church's mission as it grew out of Philadelphia was to bring an end to slavery, because the church's early parishioners were enslaved people, free people, and that was their mission. And it was sort of counter to the whole culture of South Carolina at that time for this church, a black church, to be in Charleston. So we knew that if we were going to do this, we needed to talk about that history. We needed to talk about, as we did in the book, the role that the church played in South Carolina before, after the Civil War, the impact that the city had on the church. The church was outlawed after the Denmark Vesey uprising, or alleged uprising, in 1822. The church went underground. The church was resurrected after the end of the Civil War in 1865. And some of the other tragedies and obstacles the church faced through Jim Crow into the Civil Rights Movement, and the role that this church played in the Civil Rights Movement. And then also in the book we deal with, we discuss those who lost their lives, the role that they played in the church, in the communities, and in the families. And then we also dealt with the element of forgiveness, because it was, after all, it was forgiveness that elevated this story to worldwide attention, because it was obviously very unusual for those family members doing the bond hearing on the Friday after the shooting to stand up in court and say that they forgave the shooter, and they wanted him to find some refuge in Christianity, or get closer to Jesus. So with that is kind of the framework of what my role was in this and what we hope to do in the book. And I'll turn it over to...
Since you talked about watching Raphael on TV reporting the story that night, why don't we go to Raphael and let you make some open comments.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be a part here. Welcome to America, America the Beautiful, post-racial America, where racism no longer exists, right? Well, we found out that night that racism is very much alive and well in this country. I've had several conversations with people who say, but it's not that big of a deal. It's not that many people who feel that way. Well, this incident that happened here was one person who put that much evil out into the environment. And I don't know if many of you remember, just a few months ago, up the road in Warren County, there was another guy who said he was going to pick up the suspects, or the person who, I don't even want to call his name, pick up his mantle and do the same thing at a Jewish synagogue in Warren County. So this kind of thing, we can't be blind to it. We have to be awake to it, that it still exists. I was there that night, and rather than tell you about what I saw, I thought I'd show you a little bit of what it was like that night. If you'll bear with me just for a moment, maybe 3 minutes or so. It is divided. The way I want to talk about it from the events that happened that night. I was one of the first reporters on the scene. Our crews were there. That night it was chaos and terror. And then the next day I was also reporting, and there was a different mood there, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit.
Opens fire. Aisha, stand by. I'm hearing a sound here. Officers have just drawn their weapons here at the corner of Calhoun and Meeting Street. It was an active search just moments ago looking for the shooter who came into Emmanuel AME. I'm looking and talking, trying to see exactly what's going on. We're going to make our way over here. A suspect appears to be taken into custody. Someone is being taken into custody. At this point, we're not sure who he is. He's got a gray shirt. He does have a camera. Not sure if he's a member of the media or exactly what he was doing, but officers approached him, all business. He fit parts of the description, and no, we haven't found out any information. But as William alluded to, shortly after he was taken into custody, the search didn't end there. So it wasn't as if this is the guy. And something else about him, he had on a backpack, and there was a camera strapped to his side. It appeared to be a Canon camera with a 50mm lens. At first blush, I thought maybe he was a part of the media, and he still may be. We just don't know who he is. But they quickly took him into custody, handcuffed him, walked him across the street here to the Marriott Hotel, and took him inside away from our cameras. At this point, we don't know much more than that, but I will be able to tell you from a reporter's standpoint, walking around downtown and seeing the officers with their automatic or semi-automatic weapons and their hands on the triggers, actively looking for a suspect, but they're doing so in the midst of everybody. It's a huge downtown area, and they aren't doing anything to keep people inside while this search continues. Of course, I want to temper what I'm about to tell you because none of this has been confirmed. I've been talking to witnesses and people a man who has told me he is a member of Emmanuel. He didn't want to go on camera, but he said he was there earlier today. They were having a quarterly meeting, something that's fairly routine, and after the meeting was Bible study, and it was a small group. Earlier, we heard Harv Jacobs say that only one person had come to MUSC. Well, this gentleman told me the rest of the victims, or several of the victims, may still be inside of the church. Again, this is unconfirmed information at this time. There appear to be several victims. We don't know the severity of their injuries at this time. We're still waiting to get that information, and we're going to be very careful to avoid doing anything that would upset the families at this time. But the families are coming here to the scene. They are being staged at the Embassy Suites, which is a block away from here. Bill, and I nicknamed it the People's Corner because people have been coming here. They've been gathering here all day long. This has become a place for people to voice their frustrations, if you will. It's become a place for people to talk about their sadness. Earlier, a College of Charleston student was handing out copies of a poem that she wrote. Right here at this intersection, we've been watching as people have been coming here, and across the street you see a lady with flowers. And that's what they're doing. They're going to a local florist, they're going to the Harris Teeter, the grocery stores. They're coming here with their flowers, and they are making the pilgrimage, if you will, down the street to Emmanuel AME, where they have created a shrine there. They are remembering the victims of this shooting. It's a very powerful moment. I kind of interviewed some of the people who have come back, and they are saying to me that as they sat there, one lady said she wanted to cry. It was that powerful. She didn't bring her kids because she didn't think she could handle explaining the evilness that happened to them. Another gentleman, a white gentleman, he made a point to stop by and say to me, tell them this is not the Charleston that I grew up with. So lots of emotions here. If we turn around, again, the reason why I dubbed it the People's Corner, there's several messages here. This man has a sign, it started here, it ends here. Racism starts here, ends here. There is a message, and people have various messages here, and they are coming here to display those messages. So a very busy area. Charleston, as you know, is a tourist town. And this time, people come here for the history. Today they're coming here, a lot of them, for the most recent history, the present news that is making headlines right now. And it's pretty emotional.
It just breaks my heart. It's a beautiful city. People love one another here, and I can't imagine somebody doing something so awful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That is the sentiment that we've been hearing here all day long. Can't believe somebody would do something. No, thank you. This evil, this wicked. He is, I think, back in Charleston now. We're learning.
Thank you for y'all's continued work and all the support of the police officers, the government. It's sad, but I hope Charleston unites around this. We need to come together in love, not hate, love.
Yes, ma'am.
Love will save the world.
She said it there. Love will save the world. Come.
I want to stop it, and thank you for watching that much of it. You see the night before the terror that people saw, the not knowing what had happened, the culture of Charleston. Yes, we've had our problems. South Carolina's had problems with racial divide, racial strife. Just a few weeks before this shooting, was another incident that made national headlines. A black man was shot in the back by a North Charleston police officer as he was running away. That officer was on his way to being cleared until video surfaced that caught the whole thing on camera. And the community was quite upset by this. And now to have on the heels of that another perceived racial incident where a white male walks into a predominantly black church, a historically black African-American church, and kills 9 worshipers that he sat there praying with or doing Bible study. And then as they were praying, he turns the gun on them and shoots them in cold blood. That is not the kind of thing that makes you feel warm and fuzzy about your neighbor. However, the next day, we were able to see, when these things happen, it's my experience in news and working with tragedy, and I'm sure you all have experienced some of the same things. When tragedies like this happen, we're able to see the humanity in each other a little more clear. We strip away our titles, we strip away our religions, we strip away our skin color and say, I'm human, he's human, she's human. This hurts, this sucks, I hate this crap. And we can come together and we can embrace. And that's what was happening on that second day. That hurt so many people, young, old, rich, poor, white, black. The only way they could express what they were feeling is to come to the steps of Mother Emanuel, come to the altar of Emanuel, if you would, and deposit their blessings and their prayers. And so many people cried and wept and prayed together there, of all faiths, of all ages. And it was a beautiful thing. And as you heard that lady say, you know, this isn't what we're about. And if nothing else, that horrible act, that despicable act, led to moments of love like this. And it also brought the community closer together. In interviews, the suspect said he was trying to start a race war. That's not what happened there. And from there, a movement grew where people came to the Ravenel Bridge, which today was the location of the Cooper River Bridge Run. They stretched across that bridge, a movement where they would hold hands in unity across the bridge, all colors, all faiths, and it was a beautiful, beautiful thing. As Herb mentioned, the Friday when the suspect came before the court, and family after family stood up and said, "We forgive you." That was powerful. It sent shockwaves throughout the world. Somebody could do something so evil and yet have the propensity to forgive, even though he took away their family members who did nothing but show him love, who did nothing but extend the love of Christ to him and welcome them into their Bible study. I think that sent love shockwaves throughout the world. I'll take my seat, but I just want to say that it was a terrible incident, and not every family, don't get it twisted, not every family member forgives the suspect for what happened. Still, I also covered the trial. I got a chance to talk with many of them and see them on a daily basis. Some of them say they may never forgive. One guy said, "He killed my son." If that means if I go to hell because I don't forgive him, then that's where I'm going. Okay, so very real, visceral emotions that are felt by all of this. But we do have the capabilities to push that aside and to forgive. And as you can see, we do have the wherewithal to come together and love each other. Be more than happy to address any other questions.
Thank you.
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Billie Jean Shaw. I'm a reporter at WISTV here in Columbia. So of course I'm about an hour or so away from where this tragedy happened. I was working the morning shift, sunrise. Our show starts at 4:30 a.m. So I was in bed when I got a call from the assistant news director, Demetra Walker, called me late, can't even remember, maybe an hour or so after it happened. I'm in the bed, I have to get up for work in a couple of hours, and she says, "Hey Billie, we're gonna have to send you to Charleston because there's been a shooting at the church." So immediately, I kind of rolled my eyes. I'm like, first of all, there's not a shooting at a church. The same reaction you had. Who shoots at a church? I'm like, granted, you know, things happen maybe outside the church, maybe on the steps of the church, but in the church, no. So it didn't make sense to me. But immediately got in my gear. Something told me to pack a bag. Thank God I did because I was there for the next couple of weeks, and went down to Charleston. the first station there, first reporter there from Columbia. And when I got there, I could not believe what I was seeing. I'm not from Charleston. I'm gonna come here, okay? I'm originally from Manning, but I grew up always going to Charleston. So I am used to seeing, you know, a beautiful city. And what I saw that night, people on the street crying, people holding and hugging themselves, and I could not believe what I was seeing. Started walking around the block trying to talk to people. At that point, all I knew at that point was there was a shooting inside of Mother Emanuel. And the family members of some of the victims that I did not know were dead at the time were stationed at the Embassy Suites, like a block away from the church. And when I learned what really happened, I came across a family member, and once again, had no idea that this had anything to do with race, but I will show you what I came across and when it really hit me.
People are running away from. But the most important, impactful moments I've had in this business have not been sitting at a desk. They've been out there where the stories are happening.
From my understanding, the suspect came to the church and he asked for the pastor. Where's the pastor? They showed him where the pastor is. He sat next to my cousin, Reverend Clemente Pinckney, throughout the entire Bible study. At the conclusion of the Bible study, from what I understand, they just start hearing loud noises just ringing out. And he had already wounded, the suspect had already wounded a couple of individuals, including my cousin. I spoke with one of the survivors, and she said that he had reloaded 5 different times. Spoke with one of the survivors, and she said that he had reloaded 5 different times. And her son was trying to talk him out of doing the act of killing people. And he just said, I have to do it. He said, you rape our women and you taking over our country. And you have to go.
So, at that time, once again, the only information I had at that point was there was a shooting at Mother Emanuel. I had been hearing different things, but of course, you know, when you're in the field, you're always getting all this information, but you have to, you know, take it lightly and report what you know. So I ended up somehow, I don't know how I ended up in Embassy Suites when the family was finding out, but ran across Ms. Sylvia Johnson, who is Senator Pinckney's first cousin, and I said, hey, do you know anything, what happened? And she was willing to talk to me, and I was shocked when I heard that. I believe before any national or other station got that was what the interview that I got, and it kind of just brought everything full circle. Now for me, I'm younger. I've never lived through the civil rights movement or anything like that. I only read about it, and I have older parents who lived through that, and I only heard the stories. So for me to hear that from a personal, I'll just speak personally, I was shocked. I'm not blind to the fact that racism is still well alive, being an African-American woman in South Carolina. However, I didn't know that someone, especially the suspect's age, you know, not too far away from mine, will grow up thinking something so evil. So from that point, it got real. Then I learned of the identities of the victim, learned of one of my best friends, her aunt was killed in it. The youngest victim, Tywanta Sanders, was a friend of mine as well, knew him from college. And it just was a lot of connections to this story, which made it even more difficult to talk about. Every single person, I literally had a connection with them, a friend or a family member. So that was something that was difficult as well. But as Raphael said, one thing about the coverage, that night it was horrible. People, you know, of course, angry, upset. And then the next day and the following days and still now, you just saw peace. You saw people coming together in front of the church and having conversations. Why did this happen? You know, you saw social media posts. I know here in Columbia, there started to be forums that were forming. WIS even held a couple of forums to talk about race relations and having those raw conversations that you would think that was well and done over with. But it's a conversation that still needs to happen. Unfortunately, this was the most recent tragedy for that to happen, and I hate that it did. However, some of the family members of the victims said to me, I feel like my family member did not die in vain. And as you can see, look how far, or look at the progress we've made having those real conversations since then. But when I think about the media and our responsibility to cover that, you know, that was difficult once again to hear that. But I had to put that out there. I had to release that information, and it is our jobs to be just as raw and real about what we're learning about the information. I know sometimes people think that the media has an objective and, oh, we're going to pick and choose what we want to put out there, but we only can report the facts. So at that point, the facts were this was a racially motivated killing, and from then it was up to society to take that information and proceed of how we were going to make sure that the suspect who wanted to, quote, start a race war will not do so. Following that, I was able to interview the survivors. That's a long story, so I'm not going to show that to you all, but Felicia Sanders, two of the survivors rather, Felicia Sanders and Polly Shepard. Felicia Sanders was the survivor who the next day in the courtroom when the suspect came, she said, I forgive you, may God have mercy on your soul. She was one of the people to forgive, and that, once again, putting that out there in the media, you know, could change the perspective and the feelings of other people who may have been so angry and wanted to, I guess, respond in a different way, wanted to seek revenge rather than going through this whole process with peace. So that was my experience with this. It was difficult. It's still difficult for me to talk about, especially having so many personal connections. And of course, the story then as well came to Columbia with the Confederate flag, you know, having to go cover a KKK rally and having to, you know, watch people, you know, use a piece of cloth to defend something that could be so hurtful to other folks. So the story just progressed and it touched everyone. You know, they were feeling it in Charleston and we were feeling it right here in the Midlands in Columbia, just, you know, a couple of blocks away. So that was my experience. It's still an experience. It's still not over. Just a couple of months ago, I went back to Mother Emanuel to cover the national, the statewide prayer day that then Governor Haley hosted. So it's still a conversation, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that you may have about my experience, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm Eric Frazier. No relation to her, although we've had a lot of fun pulling people's legs over the years. We actually started at the Post and Courier in Charleston on the same day, met in the elevator.
Yeah. Who are you?
Who are you? Yeah, but no relation. People still confuse us even to this day. As a matter of fact, somebody just gave you a compliment. But I'll tell you about that later. Yeah, they gave me a compliment that was meant for you. It still happens. I grew up in Colleton County, one county to the west of Charleston, and I grew up in the AME church as well. I guess the rural AME churches of Colleton County, and where I grew up. And in the churches and the religious communities that I grew up in, Mother Emanuel was sort of, you know, the kind of shining city on the hill, the place where all the little pastors who were out in the, you know, Chitlin circuit out in Colleton County, they had hoped one day to, you know, be elevated to a church like Mother Emanuel. So we always heard of Mother Emanuel. It was a place where you'd go for like district meetings and Sunday school conventions and things like that. A little bit more about me, and I'll try and bring it around real quickly. But I was a reporter at the Charleston newspaper for about 8 years. Went to Charlotte, where I was a reporter for a good long while, and was associate editor of the editorial pages and opinion writer for the last stage of my career there in Charlotte. I am one of the many people who are ex-journalists at this point. I hung up my reporter's notebook in January, and now I'm in public relations for the Duke Endowment Charitable Foundation there in Charlotte. But the Emanuel shooting was one of the last major stories that I covered that really left a lasting impression on me. That and the Keith Scott shooting in Charlotte. And I still have questions in my own head about why those two things played out the way that they did and the media coverage of them, because they were very different in a lot of ways. But I guess when I was an opinion writer at the Observer when this happened, when the Emanuel shooting happened, and immediately in Charlotte, they started asking, does anybody know Charleston? And I was, having worked in Charleston, having gone to the College of Charleston, which is where I graduated, I immediately said, hey, I'll go. I know Charleston. I need to, I felt compelled to go down just to kind of try to figure out what in the world is going on. It was just such shocking, devastating news to hear that had happened at Emanuel AME of all places. And when I got down there, I found two different things, sort of a duality. It was a really complicated thing. On the one hand, I found people really yearning for what Raphael talked about, and that lady in your video, that wanting to come together, everybody wanting to come together and just sort of experience this as a human family and somehow figure out a way to move past it and rise above it. And on the other hand, I found, just raw anger, and I'm sure you all found that too on the streets. There was one instance that still sticks with me, where I encountered Jim Clyburn, the congressman, who had come to Charleston to see what was going on, and he was outside on the streets with some staff members of his, and he was about to get back into his SUV and go, but a bunch of reporters swarmed him and wanted comments. And I asked him, do you think, because at that point it was still a little unclear what the motivation behind this was, but a little bit about what Dylan Roof had been saying had started kind of trickling out. And so I was the angry, I've known, a lot of us has probably known Jim Clyburn for years, and he's a pretty low-key kind of guy generally. And you could just feel the anger just crackling, radiating out from him at that very moment. And he looked at us and he said, I'm not sure what exactly is going on or why this happened, but if this young man, and at that point Dylan Roof had been arrested, but they were still trying to piece together why he did it. And he said, if this young man deliberately selected Emanuel AME, knowing the history of what Emanuel AME is about, it being one of the sort of cradles of the black community in Charleston, a historic church, a symbol of black resistance during slavery, during segregation, all these things. If this young man knew all these things and he deliberately selected this church and opened fire on this church, that's an act of war on the black community. And that was what Jim Clyburn said. Of course, everybody was like, ooh, boy, okay, that's strong. So I put that in a column that I had written from the scene that day. And I was really surprised at the response that readers in Charlotte had to that statement. It provoked really strong response. People saying that that was irresponsible of him. He should not say something like that. That's inflammatory. He's a congressman. He's provoking the situation. He's gonna give Dylan Roof what he wants. And I just found that really hard, a hard thing to hear people saying at that moment when anger is a very justifiable and reasonable and rational response. And the logic of what he was saying made complete sense to me. That's why I put it in I had been thinking the same thing, frankly. And so when he said it, I was like, oh yeah, that's going in favor. And it gave me a real up close and personal sense of just how far apart we really are as a society when that statement at that time, even though it's a hard thing for people to hear, maybe some people, it was a statement that needed to be said, should have been said. It was on a lot of people's minds, and so he said it. And I don't know if he got, that kind of blowback at his, him personally, but I sure got it through letters to the editor, emails, calls, people saying that was irresponsible of him and that it was irresponsible of me to put it in the paper. And so I wrote a second column basically saying, sorry, sometimes you have to hear things that are uncomfortable. And this is a time that you're going to just need to sit back and hear it. I welcome your, feedback. I'm open to dialogue, but this is where I'm coming from, and you need to hear it right now. So that was one of the things that I felt as a member of the media, having that sort of, especially as an African American journalist, trying to be true to the complexity of what I was hearing and gathering in my reporting, knowing the history of that church and of Charleston generally, and at the same time trying to also be true to that, like the folks like that lady in your video who and people of both races had that same feeling that we just have to come together. So it was really hard to kind of balance all of that out. I remember one day I wrote 2 columns that almost said different things that they were in on the same day. One, the anger, Jim Clyburn, and another trying to reflect, here's how we can all come together and sort of move along, or at least process this as a human family and become better through this. So it really was a challenge to cover this. It was one of the hardest things that I've ever had to cover, and sort of the weight of the responsibility, knowing that this is the first draft of history and all that, and trying to be accurate, trying to have the depth and and the scope and the complexity reflect it all in a way that you later on can look at and feel like you did the right thing. It was tough, and it was different than the Keith Scott situation that happened in Charlotte last summer, when we had civil unrest in Charlotte as a result of the shooting of Keith Scott, unarmed black motorist. Well, I shouldn't say unarmed. He did have a gun, but he was not armed at the time when he was the moment of the shooting. But it was very different. The reaction in Charlotte to that was very, you saw just raw rage and people, sort of mobilizing on social media, and not only mobilizing against the police, but to some extent also against the media, and feeling like the narrative that was sort of being shaped initially in the wake of that shooting was not correct, and social media pretty much took that narrative, took it over, and turned that whole situation in a different direction that I think official Charlotte wanted that to go. So I'm not sure why those two things played out so differently, but I'm still kind of fascinated by that. That would make a good book in itself.
Yeah, you gonna get started tomorrow.
All right.
Chief Scott, incidentally, is from Charleston as well.
Yeah. James Island, I think.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank all our panelists. So we are now ready to turn it over to you as questioners. If you have a question you would like to ask the panelists, now is your opportunity. I'm going to do something, however. I've got my cell phone with my little timer on it, so I'm going to ask you to keep your questions to questions. And if your question gets a bit long, like over 2 minutes, okay? Questions? I hope it's here, everybody.
So I know this particular incident is an example of racial terrorism.
Speak up just a little bit.
I said I know this particular incident is an example of domestic terrorism and racism, and I was curious to know if there was coverage for other incidents of racial terror in this area following the incident that was covered in the media locally that we just did not hear about nationally.
Well, for here, I covered a story in Clarendon County in Manning, Somerset, an AME church. Following this shooting, there was several anonymous letters sent to female pastors. I want to say maybe about a month after it had happened in Charleston, there were several anonymous letters sent to the female pastors of the AME church, basically saying you shouldn't be leading the church, and it has some threats in there. And of course, everyone is on edge because of what just happened in Charleston. There were, things going on social media that white people were driving big trucks and had Confederate flags on the back of them, and they were running people off the roadways, running black people off the roadways. So of course, there were a lot of different stories. Some of them were true, some of them weren't. But still, as the news, we had to say, hey, we're getting a lot of this into our newsroom. Just want to let you know this is a rumor, or this has happened and now this person has been arrested. There were so many copycats and people wanting attention after something so tragic. So that was something that I experienced here in the Midlands area after that shooting happened. But we did cover it, but it was crazy to see that.
And
Most definitely.
I can't recall any other major stories, maybe that just slipped through the cracks of domestic terrorism that went uncovered, because our antennae were so attuned to that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, up in Greeleyville, shortly afterwards, there was a church fire. A church burned to the ground, and everybody went. It was an African American church. It was an AME church, and we dispatched. Everybody went. Come to find out later, it was a lightning strike. But that was the mood at the time. This could be another example of racial hatred.
And another thing too about that church, I believe some years back, 20 or 30 years back, it was burned down by the KKK or something like that. Not too far from the anniversary of when it originally happened, so it was really weird. But it was a lightning strike. But of course, everyone went there because it was like, is this happening again?
Well, also on James Island near Charleston, after this, there were some shots fired into a church.
Right.
And then when the flag came down, there were some church burnings across South Carolina. So there were some events.
Can everyone hear Billie Jean when she's talking?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Mr. Eric Fraser said in a comment that it was his responsibility that you were writing the first draft of history and you were aware of it.
This Fraser.
Yeah.
That Fraser. I'm wondering, this really is an important story, and for us as media historians, were concerned with how the media covered things, and I think it was maybe the last conference here, or maybe the one before, there was a panel about the Orangeburg massacre. So one of my concerns is, has the South Carolina Historical Society contacted you as journalists to start gathering your materials that you were, to me, I'm looking at all of you and seeing in front of me the sort of people who created artifacts in the process of your work, publishing a book and that sort of thing. It's going to be immensely important to historians a couple of decades, so when, this conference is held and we're looking at that, not the Orangeburg massacre, there will be materials for historians to draw on. And so if they haven't contacted you, I would strongly encourage, I've used the South Carolina Historical Society, and it's a wonderful facility. It's now moved to the College of Charleston campus and so forth. But maybe that's something that we could do with all of this expertise and so forth, because you may not think that a little note that you wrote while you were preparing something is all that important, but someone else later on might think quite differently.
So for context, you might tell them who you are. So they have context for what you're kind of interested in.
My name's Gwen Millinger, and I teach at James Madison University, and I do historical research on the press. Generally, I'm working on a project right now that focuses on the 1950s and the late 1940s and the 1950s in the South and Southern journalism.
So as that kind of a historian, what kind of information might you want them to have that you could use later on, that they shouldn't throw away right now, for example?
One of my burning concerns is the loss of email. Because the people, happily, the people that I am writing about with my work now wrote letters, and some of them were even, the carbons, the onion skin carbons, are in the archives and that sort of thing. Save your email. I know I was a journalist, and every time I left the room, we would have office cleaning day, and people would just throw stuff away. And every time that I moved to a new job, or they got a new server or something like that, all the email went away. I'm very concerned about that. Any of your working papers, as you're taking notes from interviews, because it's kind of like the cutting room floor phenomenon. Nobody uses every single thing that they have gathered, and so there might be things in your notes that that you didn't use in your book, for example, that would be extremely interesting to somebody later on. But when you're reporting a story like the one that you're reporting, we have, we'll always have access to what was published, what was broadcast, and that sort of thing. But there's an entire archive behind the very important work that you did on this.
So this might be a time to talk about work that did not get in your book. Is there any stories, any images, anything that you wanted to get in that perhaps didn't get in, that would influence the stories you're telling?
Well, at the College of Charleston, there is the South Carolina Historical Society that moved over from the Fine School building over to Addlestone. But at the College of Charleston is another repository of Charleston's Black history, and that's the Avery Center, which is Avery, A-V-E-R-Y Center. And there's 15 linear feet of my notes there now.
Oh, good.
Because I worked at 5 different newspapers over 34 years. And my wife will tell you, I'm a pack rat, and she'll be happy with something that I'm stumbling over it. But I understand what you're saying. You're absolutely right, because all the interviews, many of the interviews that I did, I recorded them. And I could go back and I could listen very carefully to them for this book and for, so you're absolutely right about that. And hopefully we can we all collectively can do that. So because years later, people are going to be looking back on this.
Well, I know I just left the Charlotte Observer, and I lost a lot of email. Some of the emails that I was just referring to when I was talking, I don't have those. And as you mentioned that would be.
They may still
Would be
have
good
them
then.
on their server.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm going to contact the IT people and see if I can't get them to
Okay.
give that to me.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question. One of the overarching narratives that I saw a lot about what happened at Mother Emanuel were about like reconciliation and forgiveness, which is fine, right? But I didn't see a lot of stories that really allowed for Black people to have rage and to have anger and even use that anger. Sometimes that anger is like a point of access for people to even engage in activism sometimes. But I just wonder, what kind of responses did you get from the public about all of these stories about Black people just forgiving and loving and moving on, and there not being a lot of avenues to actually have them be able to express their rage? Or at least I didn't see that in a lot of the media narratives.
There were some people who were very turned off by that. They were like, no, this isn't everybody come to Jesus and hold hands and sing We Are the World. This is an issue that we have been denying has ever happened. This is an issue that people say doesn't exist, and it does. And it's right here now in our faces, and we need to deal with it. America needs to deal with it. There were those conversations. That night, I talked with community members who had come down. Yes, some of them prayed with each other, but then there were others who were like, if they tell us what he's driving, we'll go out there and we'll find him ourselves. And if we find him, there's not going to be anything for the police to do after that. There were other people I talked to after the fact who said that they had gotten phone calls from other groups who were looking to do the same. They said, if you give me that information, I'll have bikers from here to Columbia to Charlotte on the lookout for a specific car. There was anger, especially that night. Moving forward, there was still anger. Again, everybody didn't forgive, and everybody didn't subscribe to that turn the other cheek philosophy.
But did that get into stories? The anger you were talking about, where people said, "We'll get it if we know who it is."
We did some stories about it. Mostly, though, that anger was felt in social media. And social media is another wrinkle, another estate, if you will, to the telling of these stories. A lot of different opinions, avenues, thoughts were found in social media.
I would say working in television, sometimes it's difficult. I totally had a lot of people who, like I feel the same. We don't forgive the news, Billie Jean, why are you putting that out there? It's not really like that. Y'all need to tell the real story, But then it gets a little tricky sometimes. You go and you said, okay, I want to talk to you. And then sometimes people are so overcome by anger, they're saying cuss words, or they're saying like, I'm going to go and I'm going to kill him. And it's kind of like you really want to put that out there and create, we're talking about peace come together, and then you don't want to like entice a riot too. So at the same time, I had to be selective of what type of people that I put on there, only because of, management and FCC and, of what I can do on a broadcast platform. But what I did use, though, Facebook Live, not Facebook Live, was Facebook Live even out then? I don't believe so. Periscope or videos, I recorded videos and, just posted it on my Facebook page, my social media pages, where people can really express themselves. So did all of it get on in a package or on television? No, because of that reason. But I still try to find another outlet to post that where people can really, express themselves without having to be fined for it, from a federal level.
We did make efforts to show that not everybody forgave.
Mm-hmm.
We did make efforts to show that it wasn't, again, like I said, everything is okay now. We forgive.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I think a big part of how those narratives get shaped in the initial aftermath of these types of incidents is sometimes, well, and I'm going back to the Keith Scott shooting again.
Did you give us enough context of Keith Scott? Let everybody know that. What the
Oh,
story
okay.
is.
Well, Keith Scott, African American gentleman in Charlotte, as everybody knows about the mass protests in Charlotte last summer. Keith Scott's shooting was the spark of that, and he was African American man who was sitting in his car in the parking lot of his apartment complex, and police were coming to the apartment complex to serve a search warrant, totally unrelated to him, but they saw him sitting in his car. They thought they smelled marijuana or saw marijuana. They said they saw a gun at one point in the car with him, and so they diverted from the search warrant that they were about to serve, and then went tactical on Keith Scott and started banging on the windows, ordering him out of the car. Keith Scott has what is his learning disability, or
He was in an accident. He had
traumatic head injury, brain injury. And so he was on medication at the time, really strong medication. So he did not react well, I suppose you could say, to all these strange men suddenly banging on his window, ordering him out of the car. One guy's got a baton trying to smash the window on the passenger side. He gets out of the car, makes what officers perceive to be threatening movements. They think he has a gun.
And these are undercover officers, not
undercover.
Plainclothes people.
Right. So in the immediate aftermath of this shooting, his family, especially on social media, were very critical of the police officers. And they said he was reading a book at the time, that he was minding his own business, waiting for a child to get off the bus. And officers basically just came up and, essentially executed him. And that took off on social media. Really angry videos of his daughter, I think it was, saying that her father had basically been executed by the police. That went viral, and people started picking up on that. And next thing you know, you've got crowds out there at the scene, and the crowds are yelling at the cops and boxing the police in, and police are trying to get out, and it just sort of mushroomed from there. I still wonder to this day if the families in the Emmanuel situation had reacted differently. Would Charleston have gone the way that Charlotte did? I don't know. But that's a question that I think someone should look into.
I think it's a good one too, because people were saying that the way that Mike Brown's mother and stepfather reacted immediately after he was shot and killed, people felt like that incited more violence. I don't know if that's true.
It's a possibility. We talked about this before, and the incident before with Walter Scott, who was shot in the back, and you've seen that video. We were ready. The public, the Charleston area, African Americans were ready to react, and they did react. Not in a Ferguson manner, not in a Baltimore manner in terms of rioting, but they mobilized and they were ready to say, "Look, we're not going to put up with this. Our black men being gunned down by police." And it came so quickly that once the video came out, the mayor came out and fired the officer. He was charged. That kept Ferguson from coming to Charleston. That kept Charleston from burning. And several people have said, when Felicia Sanders said, "I forgive you," that saved Charleston from burning, like you're saying. But I think also how swiftly the suspect was arrested, that also had something to do with it. Things were in motion. There wasn't time for it to fester. There wasn't time for that injury to grow deeper because of inactivity, because of the possibility that the person may escape punishment for what had happened. So I think all of that came together to create a different reaction
for the Charleston area.
Other questions?
Well, can I make a quick, on your on the issue of anger. In Charleston, there is a layer of anger always under another layer of gentility. Keep in mind, Charleston is the cradle of slavery. And the past is always present in Charleston, just in the physical Charleston that you see in the historic district. This topic is always on everyone's mind. So the issue of, like you said, the forgiveness immediately, I think, extinguished that. But forgiveness is one thing, but a lot who did not forgive, but even though some did forgive, they did not forget. They did not step away from it. And also, there was a lot of pushback within the Charleston community with external forces coming in to create a Ferguson and a Baltimore. That night of the shooting, there was a lot of pushback. And then the other thing that attests to the anger in Charleston, the perpetual anger, is Charleston has been dealing with this angry nature through a group of clergy across all racial and theological lines. The Charleston area Justice Ministries, or would be just called KJAM. They have been having an ongoing dialogue, and still has had an ongoing dialogue with elected leaders in Charleston over a variety of issues like unnecessary police stops, high dropout rates or incarceration rates for kids in schools, and a number of things. So before the shooting and even before Walter Scott, there's been this connection between the community through the churches and the leaders. So when Emmanuel happened, immediately they were able to connect and have a series of prayer vigils and peaceful marches. But maybe if we did not have that infrastructure already in place, it would have taken some time to build up that dialogue and those connections to create some of these things, to bring some sense of calm, peace, and direction to Charleston, which led to, I think, the avoidance of a Ferguson and Baltimore.
And the Black Lives Matter movement picked up steam there. In my mind, I think this was more towards the Walter Scott thing, but there were protests, there were tie-ups on the Ravenel Bridge. There were things that were being done to let people know, no, we're not just being docile. We are speaking out on some of these things.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. We have a very tight schedule for lunch, and we don't want the food to be cold. So let's thank our panelists for